One of the most ruthless and brutal kings to have ever ruled over a country was Henry VIII, who is most famous for the fact that he had 6 wives, and he executed 2 of these inside the Tower of London. But his changes to England and the nation's religion caused chaos and resulted in the slaughter of thousands of people, some in the most horrific ways possible, such as hanging, drawing, and quartering. One of the most shocking religious changes that Henry devised, with Thomas Cromwell his chief adviser, was the dissolution of the monasteries, and this made Henry VIII very rich, as he made thousands of monks and nuns homeless. He stole their land and houses, as well as their valuables and their riches. Henry VIII sold off as much of the land cheaply as he could, and he raised huge sums for foreign wars, but there were protests against the king, including the Pilgrimage of Grace. But many religious and peaceful people paid the ultimate price for their differing of ideas to the king. One man was a senior church leader in Somerset. Richard Whitting, the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, was ruthlessly executed by Henry VIII, and what happened to his remains following this was horrific. Richard Whitting was born around the year 1460, and this was during the conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Despite the Civil War, Whitting was educated inside of Glastonbury Abbey and was then sent to Cambridge to study, and he then, following graduating, became a priest and rose to the position of a deacon in the church. He was a very clever man and also then worked as a chamberlain in Glastonbury Abbey and was responsible for a number of differing areas in the building. Following the death of the previous abbot of the abbey, Richard Bear, many of the monks then selected Richard Whitting to be the next head and the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, and Cardinal Wolsey also helped their decision, and at the time he was Henry VIII's right-hand man. Wolsey believed that Whitting was an upright and religious monk, a provident and discreet man, and a priest commendable for his life, learning, and virtues. The reputation of Richard even got to the very top and inside of royal circles, and he was selected as the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey and was in control of one of the most profitable and richest houses inside of England. This made it a big target when Henry VIII and Cromwell began to dissolve the monasteries, as it had a significant amount of wealth behind it. It had a huge income, but Whitting mixed with members of the king's court, and he sent many gifts to the king, Henry VIII. He also oversaw a huge number of renovations to the abbey and added another chapel to it. He was a very generous man and helped to raise money for the poor and feed them, and he opened the abbey's doors twice a week for people in need to come to receive meals and some form of care. At this time in England, Henry VIII was getting tired of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because he had become obsessed with Anne Boleyn, his future second wife. Anne would not take to the king's bed unless she became his wife and queen, and this forced Henry to turn his back on the church. He proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Church of England and split from Rome, and he was then seen as the ultimate authority over religion in the country. But Henry VIII then ordered all senior members of the clergy to swear support to him. Richard Whitting, the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, said he would speak to the Pope on the king's behalf, but Thomas Cromwell then utilised his sway to shut down many different monastic houses and religious buildings across England. He suspended the power and authority of the bishops and sent a huge number of lawyers and investigators into religious houses to survey the buildings. They had 86 questions to fill out, and they inspected everything, looking for reasons to shut down the building. The king would then seize all of the wealth and the land of the abbey. To begin with, inside of Glastonbury Abbey, there was nothing that could be found which was out of order. Some abbots were known for being slightly corrupt, and one was even allegedly caught in bed with a woman when Cromwell's lawyers called around. One was said to have been the drunkest knave living, and Cromwell obtained royal approval to shut down many religious houses. All houses which had an annual income less than £200 were shut down, but Richard Whitting was informed that Glastonbury Abbey would be safe to begin with. But Cromwell's men kept coming around, and they accused Whitting's leadership and said he was leading monks astray, but of course this wasn't true. In January of 1539, Glastonbury Abbey was the only monastery standing in Somerset, as the rest had been shut down. On the 19th September, yet again, the royal commissioners came back, and Richard Whitting was not there. The men walked into the abbey, raided Whitting's apartments, and seized many letters and papers. They tried to look for the reason to shut the abbey down, but when Whitting came back to his home, he was accused of speaking ill about the king. He was then sent to the Tower of London. Inside of the Tower of London, Richard Whitting was kept in rough conditions. He was at this time an elderly and rather frail man, and Cromwell advised inside of the tower to interrogate him for what was probably treason. This was very stressful for him, and let's remember that he hadn't done anything wrong. It was claimed that inside of his chambers a gold plate was found along with money with hidden vaults, and this was used as evidence of treason. He was not allowed to go to trial and was sentenced to death by an act of attainder. Cromwell stated that the Abbot of Glaston to be tried at Glastonbury and also executed there with his accomplices. But the fate of Richard was spoken about at royal court, as a French ambassador claimed that Richard, inside of the tower, was accused of taking treasure worth 200,000 crowns, and he claimed that they found evidence that he was supporting Catherine of Aragon. Richard's execution was hastily organised, and this was to occur before there were chances for Parliament to discuss what had happened and his fate. At the age of roughly around 80 years old, which was very old for a man of the Tudor period, Richard Whitting, the last Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, was taken to Somerset from the Tower of London. He left on the 14th of November 1539, and a trial confirmed his death sentence, and he was sent on the arduous journey back to his old religious house. Some of his friends had turned against him because they wanted to save themselves and not risk an execution, but he, along with 2 of his monks, the following day were then dragged through the streets of Glastonbury behind a horse. He was a local man and was very well known, but here was the former abbot who had given shelter to the poor and food to them being paraded through the streets for his execution. After this he was then taken up to his own abbey, which at this time stood empty as it had been dissolved. He was then dragged up to the Tor for his execution, and the horses dropped him off on the top of the hill overlooking the town he had known so well. He was taken to a gallows which had been made on the hill especially for him. The 3 men waited for their executions with solemnity and patience, and Richard Whitting, the 80-year-old abbot, was then given to the executioner. He was hanged from the gallows until he was almost dead, and then the executioner then slashed the ropes, and his lifeless body was sent crashing to the scaffold. Following this, he then had his insides cut out and his genitals cut off, which were then burned in front of him. Then came the beheading, and the executioner cut his head off in swift fashion, and his body was then cut into 4 different pieces, and this was then sent to the nearby villages and towns to be displayed. The towns of Bridgewater, Ilchester, Wells and Bath all displayed the body parts of the former Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, and his head was humiliatingly fastened on a pike above Glastonbury Abbey, his former house and home that he had devoted large parts of his life towards. Inside of England and Henry VIII's kingdom, Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset was one of the last monasteries to be dissolved, and was one of the most profitable for Henry VIII, as the abbey did hold many riches. It was a building which provided help for the needy and the poor, but Henry VIII saw the head of this house as a troublemaker, and as someone who would stand in the way of him getting even more richer. Richard Whitting, at the age of roughly 80, was subjected to a harrowing ordeal of hanging, drawing and quartering, and was murdered barbarically. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.